Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. With Russia's war in Ukraine, we've seen a fundamental shift in Germany's foreign, security, and energy policy. And I think it's fair to say that before the current conflict, there was little discussion about nuclear defense in Germany. Putin's nuclear threats and sable rattling has led to a re-examination of Germany's approach to nuclear deterrence. So to talk about Germany and this idea of nuclear deterrence, I am absolutely delighted to welcome foreign policy and security expert, Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. His latest book is titled Deutschlands nukleare Interessen, or Germany's Nuclear Interests. And in it, he re-examines Germany's nuclear defense policy. Karl-Heinz, herzlich willkommen. It is wonderful to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind invitation, Steve. Yes, indeed, the nuclear issue is back also in Germany. Last year in June, a couple of months after the war started, we had a poll in Germany indicating that 52% of the Germans support the presence of US nuclear forces on German soil. I'm in this business for 40 years. I never saw such a thing. 65% of these supporters were voters of the Greens. So you see that we had a fundamental change in this country. So I would like to raise three quick questions today. Namely, first, what has changed what has changed in the nuclear realm by the Ukraine war? Second, what are Germany's nuclear interests? It might sound strange that a non-nuclear country can have nuclear interests, but it has. And I think they're comparable to many other European countries. And the third question, always what the politicians ask, what do we have to do now? What should Germany, what should other countries do? Let me start with the changes imposed by the nuclear war on nuclear issues. First, it is obvious that nuclear weapons played a crucial role in the war right from the beginning, simply because Russia threatened the use of nuclear weapons right from the beginning in a way which we didn't even have in the darkest hour of the Cold War. So far, this threat didn't come. It didn't come true. It seems to be likely, but still we cannot exclude it. So nuclear escalation is always possible. And furthermore, nuclear weapons safeguarded, so to speak, Russia's invasion and made the war possible. I don't think that without nuclear weapons, Russia would have attacked Ukraine, or seems to be counterfactual now, but NATO or the US or whoever would have had long intervened and would have defeated Russia decisively. Second point, it's actually the bad point, there will be no arms control, nuclear arms control or disarmament for many years to come, simply because there's no trust in the Russian regime, and without a little bit of trust, you cannot enter into any agreement. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because we are lacking elements of communication and elements of confidence building. And this means that the Russian nuclear arsenal remains as it is, and the Chinese is likely to rise. Point number three, the idea of the nuclear-free world has become what it always was, an illusion. And this is not tragic at all because we got rid of a pipe dream. It was a pipe dream when Obama proposed it in 2009, and it was a pipe dream when the UN came up with the ban treaty in 2021. Not to be misunderstood, maybe a nuclear-free world would be a better one. I don't exclude this. However, what all these abolitionists forget is that the nuclear weapon states don't want to give up their nuclear weapons. Whether we like it or not, whether we understand it or not, they regard nuclear forces as an element of their security, which means Pakistan has them because of India, India because of China, the Russians have them for all the reasons I just mentioned. Israel has them for the things we are seeing now in these days. France has them because of grandeur, and North Korea has them because it has a completely nuttish government there. Point number 4, this means that nuclear weapons remain a factor in world politics. Because even the value has been raised because, as I said, they have protected Russia from external intervention. This is why, by the way, Iran wants to have them so badly. So the number of nuclear weapon states is even likely to raise. And this means that nuclear deterrence keeps an important role in the prevention of war, because it confronts every attack on a nuclear state with nuclear retaliation. That's not a news, but it's back on the scene. And point number 5, this means for Germany and most other European NATO allies that nuclear deterrence still has to be provided by the US in the framework of NATO, because there's no other provider. This does not make it easier, because the transatlantic relations are not as robust in these days as they have been years ago. The US, for good reasons, is less and less willing to subsidize European security, and the resurgence of an isolationist president type of Trump cannot be excluded. And for that reason, it is crucial that we make the transatlantic relationship Trump-proof. And one element or one way of making it Trump-proof is, for instance, spending 100 billion euros as the Germans did in the Zeitenwende process. The flip side of all this is that we further have to deal with a dangerous concept. Nuclear deterrence is dangerous because it can go wrong. And when it goes wrong, the consequences would be a disaster. Moreover, as we all know, it's full of dilemmas and open questions. And the biggest issue is the question of credibility. How credible is nuclear retaliation if you risk your self-destruction? And it gets even more complicated if we talk about extended deterrence, the idea that a nuclear weapon state like the US takes a nuclear commitment for its non-nuclear allies. So how credible is it that the US will risk its own territory for the allies? It's a very old question we have since decades in NATO. How likely is it that the US president will risk San Francisco to save Warsaw or Berlin? At the end, this is theology. You can believe it or not. You can try to have technical solutions, putting weapons on German soil to make this more credible. At the end, it is nuclear theology. Either you believe it or you don't. France does not believe it for good reasons. France says that nuclear weapons are only national weapons. They can only protect the nation that possesses them. And this is why they came up with their own nuclear arsenal. As the French are saying, le nucléaire ne se partage pas. You cannot divide the nuclear, which is not a stupid conclusion. Mm-hmm. Second point, what are Germany's nuclear interests now? In the Cold War, Germany had nuclear interest as a non-nuclear country because we were at the brink between East and West, and we would have been, with many other European allies, the nuclear battlefield of any war between East and West, and that would have been devastating for Germany. So which means our first nuclear interest was in a credible nuclear deterrence, to have not to have a war at all, be it conventional or nuclear. And the second nuclear interest was to have information on what kind of nuclear weapons the US and the UK have in Germany. Where are they? What are the plans? What is the logic? What are the strategies? We would like to know, because we were affected. We would have been affected the first by any nuclear employment. And the third interest was not only to have information, but also to have an impact, to have a say, to have an influence on US nuclear planning, and to have some kind of participation or consultation to diminish or to minimize the damage in case of war. We even had NATO consultation guidelines. So because the US provided all this, the US provided for the Europeans information and influence through the nuclear planning group. And if we are now back in the nuclear world, then we have again German nuclear interests, and they're basically the same. Deterrence, not to have a war at all. Second, information to know what's going on. And third, to have an impact on US, particularly US nuclear strategy, which means we have to influence future nuclear strategy, not to be the object where others decide about, but to shape our nuclear future. This will not be easy, neither for the Germans nor for other Europeans, because our political elites have mostly forgotten all the lessons and the knowledge and the expertise of the Cold War. The nuclear planning group was dormant till 2014 because nuclear planning wasn't necessary. Hence, a part of the Zeitenwende will be to actively pursue Germany's nuclear interests, the three which I just mentioned. How do we do this? What should politics, what should the German government, also other European governments do? First, let me start with what they should not do. Mm-hmm. They should not talk about German nuclear weapons. This is a non-starter. We don't need them. Unfortunately, no one in Germany proposes this except some few academics who do it in talk shows. And second, don't talk about a European nuclear deterrence provided by France. This is a non-starter by definition, because France doesn't accept the idea of nuclear extended nuclear deterrence. So this entire thing would come on the wrong track. I'm surprised to see that some German parliamentarians still go around with this idea. So what should we do? 3 quick points. First, Germany needs to acquire nuclear expertise again, what we call in NATO raising the nuclear IQ, which means government officials, parliamentarians, civil servants, also journalists, need to be educated again on the nuts and bolts of nuclear deterrence, including the bad part, the dilemmas of nuclear deterrence. The number of university professors in Germany who teach nuclear knowledge is less than the fingers of one hand. Our political academies don't teach it at all. Our General Staff College of the German Armed Forces does not teach nuclear issues. When I was president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, I was proposing to have nuclear elements in our courses. The Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Office, which was at that time my boss, was not happy and said, no, it's not the right time, you shouldn't do it. So we have to change this definitely. If you recall that in the German Ministry of Defense in the Cold War, an entire branch, some 20 people, were dealing with nuclear weapons, with nuclear deterrence. Today, it is one military officer who does it part-time, among other issues in the NATO, in the NATO section. Second, what NATO should do is we should actively pursue a nuclear debate in NATO for a new nuclear consensus. The last nuclear document, the last consensus document we have in NATO stems from 2012, the so-called Deterrence and Defense Posture Review document, as complicated as the title. And that was before Crimea. It was when Russia and China were still partnered. It was when we had the idea of the Arab Spring. So it is long overdue. So a new nuclear strategy is necessary, and Germany needs to push for this for 3 reasons. First, because we are heavyweight in NATO. Second, because we are a nuclear stationing country, which means we have a stake in the business. And third, it would be a chance to regain lost trust, particularly in Eastern Europe, which would be helpful. However, if we do this, if Germany pushes for this, then a couple of nasty questions will come up. For instance, we have now B-61 bombs deployed in Germany, a very small number. Is this enough, or do we need a new Nachrüstung? Do we need a new dual track decision, or whatever? Do we need new nuclear weapons? The answer to this question doesn't have to be yes necessarily. Still, you have to be prepared to discuss it. And the second issue that comes up is the locations. Currently, we have nuclear weapons in Germany, in Italy, in Belgium, and in Holland, which means fairly much in the back. Wouldn't it make sense, make more sense to have them in Poland, in the Baltic states? Or let's assume that Ukraine joins NATO. Does this mean that we would have to put them even further to the east? Also this, there is no yes and no, still it has to be discussed. And the third thing Germany should do is it should enter in a dialogue with the two other nuclear powers we have with France and with the UK in Europe. Why France and the UK are already having this nuclear dialogue under the Lancaster House Agreement? France always, since decades in the meantime, proposed such a nuclear dialogue to Germany. It always had an anti-American stance. That was one of the reasons why Germany didn't accept it. I think now it's time to accept this and to have this trilateral dialogue with the same idea of nuclear interest, namely to have information, not to have an alternative to a US extended deterrence, but to have information. To do this, to be able to do this, you have to once again raise the nuclear IQ, which brings us back to the beginning of our talk, which means that we have the Zeitenwende in Germany. The Zeitenwende went further than I would have ever expected 1.5 years ago. And now we need a Zeitenwende also in the nuclear realm. And on that happy note, I thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, Karl-Heinz, thank you very much for sort of really weaving a very bright field for us to discuss and a couple of elements that I'd like to unpack a little bit further. We already have some questions from some of our viewers, and one of our viewers actually picked up on something that you said very early on in the first part of your remarks, which is they write, how can you say that the transatlantic relationship is not as strong as it was, given how the war in Ukraine really mobilized and unified a very strong West? So some sort of question about the strength of the transatlantic partnership at the moment.
This is absolutely true. I mean, I think one of the major miscalculations of Xi Jinping and Putin was to believe that this West is weak. And we gave all the signs of being weak. But then at the end of the day, this West is back. We are united in NATO. Also, Germany has become the second. I mean, from the embarrassing idea of providing 5,000 helmets, we are now the second largest provider of military aid to Ukraine. So the West is back, but you cannot take this for granted. Yeah. The US is a divided country. I don't know, a Trump or a Trump clone is possible, and then we are back to square one. So for the time being, I think we are very happy all to see this, but it is not something that we can take for granted. And we Europeans have to work on this, because some of the complaints, even of the Trumpies, are and were justified.
So Karl-Heinz, you were a sort of special officer, special representative in the Ministry of Defense up until this summer, and you worked with the policy planning team on Germany's new national security strategy. And I'd be very interested in two things. One is how difficult were some of the discussions around nuclear deterrence in shaping that national security strategy? And then the other piece is we recently had a visit from a parliamentary state secretary from the Ministry of Defense who said the national security strategy is one thing. When it comes to implementation of some of the policy recommendations, that's going to be another thing. And we at the ministry are working on that right now. So can you talk a little bit about some of the internal functionings of how some elements of the strategy as they pertain to the deterrence issues that you're talking about might be implemented?
Well, to give you a general impression, my view was that the entire discussion on the national security strategy, given that we were tackling thorny issues, and nuclear deterrence is only one. We are talking about arms exports, really difficult in Germany. We are talking about 2% codification in the national security, really difficult. We are talking about the old question of, if the defense budget raises, should also the expenditures for development aid raise in the same percentage. All very thorny issues which belong to certain ministries. I was surprised how fairly consensual it went. We had at the end only two issues which remained. One was the 2%, and the other thing was on the famous National Security Council, whether we have this or not. That didn't happen due to internal developments, but all the rest went fairly well. By the way, we had a strong commitment of the new government, even before the national security strategy, already in the coalition agreement, where was a strong commitment in favor of nuclear Teilhabe, German nuclear participation. And in the Zeitenwende speech, we had the decision to buy the F-35, which guarantees German participation for the next decades to come. The national security first is the first one we ever did in Germany. So don't expect any miracles. The good thing is it is a real strategy, which means it's a relation between ends and means and how to get there. Of course, it is very generic, because under it you have other strategies. You have a China strategy, we have a space strategy, we have now specific Bundeswehr guidelines to come, which make it more specific. And then, of course, it's absolutely true. It is one thing to agree something on paper, and then to have, for instance, the money, for instance, the famous 2%. We have now 100 billion, with which we can guarantee the 2% for the next 4 years, 5 years. What happens if the money is consumed? And we have all the other demands on climate, on what have you, all the other, on education and God knows what. So this will be a tough discussion. Still, what makes me optimistic, and I close with this point, what makes me really optimistic is, and that's why I believe, by the way, that the Zeitenwende is lasting, is simply because it has been done by a red-green coalition, by two parties who do not have the military in their DNA. And for them, the change was much more difficult and painful as it would have been for a conservative team. It is like 1999 when we had a red-green coalition joining the Kosovo War. Painful for them, but it meant a leap forward in the German security policy. So I think it is lasting, yes.
So one question just came in from one of our viewers that really picks up exactly on that comment. And this viewer writes, can you speak to the prospects of a nuclear Zeitenwende against the backdrop of the increasing popularity of the German right, i.e. the AfD, and the left, Wagenknecht?
Well, the interesting thing is that both of these populist movements, they don't talk about nuclear deterrence.
Right.
Maybe it is too complex. The success of many populist movements, be it in Germany, the AfD, be it Donald Trump in the US, be it Erdogan in Poland, is that they take up the anger of the people, but if it comes to finding solutions, to proposing something concrete, what shall we do now, you don't find that much. And this is why some of the populist movements are short-lived. And maybe this happens to the AfD as well. Currently, they are surfing on this wave of discontent on God knows what, but I didn't hear anything, neither in favor nor against, from AfD or from Die Linke. Wagenknecht, not sure whether she knows something about, okay, she knows by definition on everything something, but this is not an issue. Actually, the Greens, back to the Zeitenwende, were the party which was most forthcoming in the entire process. The SPD was the most hesitant one and had to convince itself much more. So I don't see this as a fundamental problem. Yeah.
So Karl-Heinz, a little earlier, you used the term nukleare Teilhabe, and of course you talked a little bit about that earlier. One of our viewers did want to know more about the original purpose of Germany's participation in the nukleare Teilhabe and whether it's still valid. And I think you've started to unpack that a little bit for us. But the viewer is also curious as to why the Poles now want to be part of this process as well.
Well, first, the nuclear Teilhabe is not a new thing. It stems from the Cold War, exactly from this interest, which I mentioned earlier, German and European interest in influencing US nuclear plans. And this is why we had a number of steps in which the Europeans could bring in their ideas. And one symbolic, you might say, step was this nuclear Teilhabe, where the Allies, Germany, Italy, Holland, has the means of delivery, the plane, and the US has the nuclear bomb, the nuclear device. So like two keys in a crisis, both keys would be merged together, the bomb under the plane, and then it would fly with a German pilot to its mission. Is this changing the fate of the world? No, it's not, because if the Germans would say, we do not give the plane, so you cannot drop your bomb, the US has, I don't know, 1,500 other bombs and means and nuclear means. It was just an important act of symbolism to show the Europeans take their share. And it's also a risk sharing, because in the Cold War, and the thing is still true today, or it will become true again, if you have US nuclear weapons stationed on your own soil, you become a target. You become a target for Soviet/Russian/whoever aggressor who wants to do this. So it's also a means of burden sharing, if you say so. And this is why we have it still, even it's in a very limited way. We are talking about a very small number of nuclear weapons in Germany and in other countries. And now, of course, Poles have an interest for the reasons I just said. Yeah. They were put to Germany at a time when Germany was at the Iron Curtain. And now, actually, Poland feels himself, at least with regard to Belarus, at the Iron Curtain, more or less. And so it makes strategically, you could argue that it would make sense to put them forward. And then the US says, wow, but this costs a fortune because all these technicalities, but it will be a discussion that will come. Yes.
So related to that, I mean, particularly given some of the countries that you've been talking about, one of our viewers is interested in some scenarios that a lot of people have been thinking about when it comes to the Slogan Gap, right? This is the border between Lithuania and Poland, between Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Our viewer writes, what if a nuclear bomb went off in that area? A, does NATO have decision-making capabilities in place to decide on a response? But B, what if NATO decided that the proper response would be to drop a small nuke in a less populated area of Kaliningrad, for example? Is this something that a German pilot would carry out?
Well, first, NATO has all the structures in place. We just have in these days one of the nuclear exercises going on. We had these exercises always during the Cold War to do all the planning issues. You are talking about a really delicate thing, which actually you don't want to think through. I think if a nuclear bomb gets dropped for whatever reason in the Slogan Gap, this will change the entire world in such a fundamental way. Now you can plan, as we did in the Cold War, of the first strike and then the second strike back and then the third strike. And I mean, to be honest, I don't want to find it out. So this is for the nuclear theologists. I think, by the way, that nuclear deterrence is a fairly stable business so far. The reason that Russia does not implement its nuclear threats, which it did against those who are supporting Ukraine, shows also Russia is not interested in escalation, because no one knows what happens. I don't know whether first strike, second strike, German pilot, US pilot, and so on. No one knows what happens. The first nuclear mushroom, that's why, because it didn't happen for so many years, that it would alter the conflict in an unprecedented way. And I think both sides are not interested in doing so. And that's why we still have to exercise this, because one of the dilemmas of nuclear deterrence is nuclear weapons have to be usable, not to be used.
Yeah.
You have to show that you have them. You have all the procedures in place, but this should not lower the threshold of actually using them because they haven't been used for the last 75 years, fortunately. It's part of this nuclear game. It is not a guarantee that it goes on functioning, but so far it worked quite well.
Yeah. So, and you did say in your opening remarks that nuclear deterrence has maintained an important role, that it's back on the scene with a vengeance, in large part because of Putin's posturing in the conflict in Ukraine. Another of our viewers submitted another question saying that deterrence has at least two established forms, and mentions both MAD, mutually assured destruction, and Star Wars. MAD is being questioned, and the big question is whether the West really has the resolve to retaliate. Star Wars was sidetracked in the 1970s, and so the viewer goes on to ask, shouldn't we try to use our diminishing technological lead to revive our strategy of destroying Russian and Chinese ICBMs and hypersonic missiles? I guess, the question there is, are there other measures that can be taken to try to reduce this, especially given that you think that the days of arms control are over, at least for now?
Well, I mean, ballistic missile defense, which is the catchword under this, basically under which this question goes, never was over. We have it on all different layers. Apparently, it is just too complex, too expensive, and too challenging to do it on a strategic level. Mm-hmm. And we had this lesson since the good old SDI days, when we were discussing that you can counter every anti-ballistic missile capacity by having more warheads, and then you saturate all the defense, and so on and so forth. So I think at the end, this idea to have this cloche, to have this Star Wars shield, is not going to work. On the other hand, I'm not so terribly concerned about Russian nuclear attack. You cannot exclude this. If Russia feels itself painted in the corner, maybe. On the other hand, first, it is not granted should Putin order tomorrow to launch a nuclear weapon, it is not sure that the Russian General Staff follows this. Like General Miley said, that he would not have followed a nuclear order given by President Trump. Second point, it sounds silly, but I mean, since nothing functions in Russia, I'm not sure whether the entire procedure would function, including the nuclear weapon. So, and then the question is, what would be the purpose? To send a nuclear signal, to detonate it over the Baltic Sea, and you have a hole in the Baltic Sea, fine, what then? Even if you detonate it on Ukrainian soil, what then? Would Ukraine stop fighting immediately? I mean, this entire thing, we have this idea, nuclear explosion, and then it's over. Then whatever happens, peace, forgotten, no one knows. And I think the Russians are not sure either. So, as I said, we cannot exclude this. We try to protect as good as possible. But as I said, with regard to the strategic level, the last 30 years, 40 years displayed, that's apparently too challenging, or you never get a 100% guarantee. And then the question is whether it makes sense to spend all the money.
I mean, I think that as you said, this notion of nukleare Teilhabe is nothing new, right? It's part of a partnership, if you will. One of our viewers asks about the placement of nuclear deterrence further north, especially given that we have new NATO members, Finland, hopefully Sweden in the not too distant future. Do you think that there's a possibility of sort of expanding that nuclear deterrence partnership?
Well, wait a minute. I mean, first, nuclear Teilhabe or nuclear partnership or influence on the nuclear plants does not necessarily mean that you have to have weapons stationed on your soil. The US nuclear umbrella exists also in South Korea and in Japan, and they do not have US nuclear forces on their soil. The South Koreans, in the meantime, start to press for this because it gives a symbol of credibility. you could, if the US states, as it has done, that it is ready to step in, so to speak, to risk nuclear escalation to protect their allies, they could do it through submarines. You could also have the symbolism by sending so you do not have to have nuclear weapons in Norway, for instance, or in Sweden or in Finland. You can send a nuclear submarine to visit the Swedish port and let it be visible. So also this sends the signal to a potential aggressor, in that case Russia, of don't fool around. Is this a guarantee that at the end of the day the US steps in for the allies? I don't know. Is this something I do want to find out? No, I'm not sure either. So I'm fairly happy with this, but it is not that Teilhabe necessarily only means this mechanism of airplane and bombs to be combined.
So you had said that you do not foresee opportunities for arms control negotiations, nuclear arms control negotiations in the near future because of the situation that we're in right now. How concerned are you about the inability to come up with any agreements?
On what?
On either disarmament or on maintaining the arms levels where they are right now, not expanding any further. I mean, I think that many people felt that there were some reasonable arms control agreements in place, and that gave them some peace of mind. That the situation would not grow any worse. That seems to be on hold at the moment. I guess sort of how concerned are you about this Leerlauf, right? This open period that we're in right now?
Well, first, I mean, the nuclear powers, US and Russia, have reduced their stockpiles significantly over the last 20 years, 30 years. Point one. Point two, they are still sticking to the arms control agreements, even if they are no longer in place. The fact that that the Russians announced to cancel the test ban treaty doesn't mean that they start nuclear testing tomorrow. It's one of these games which we're having now. What I can foresee, because we don't know how this war ends and what kind of Russia we have. Russia is, I mean, the war in Russia ruins the country. Economically, politically, militarily, the sanctions cut them off from anything. When we are talking about digitalization, about artificial intelligence, about autonomous driving, about industry 4.0, all this is not happening in Russia for the next years and decades to come. Maybe that the Russians, like in 1991, 92, cannot afford their costly nuclear arsenal anymore. I don't know. So there might be a pressure to disarm just from the pure incapacity to sustain it. For the time being, the Russians do not have any need because they just modernized their nuclear arsenal. So they are not going to increase it, but it is fairly modern and fairly in place. Is there a chance to reduce? Maybe. But first, we have to see what kind of Russia we will have.
But I guess, part of the concern, especially with this recent announcement that Russia was withdrawing its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, gives pause, right? I mean, there are some people who are very concerned that this is a step in a possible renewed global nuclear arms race, and that's something that we should all worry about.
Well, for an arms race, you need the money and you need the capacities. I mean, since now, this is not a joke, since now Russia buys to a large degree European fridges, because even modern fridges have little chips in it and you can use this for other technical things, it shows how dramatic it is. Civil aircraft in Russia is hardly existing anymore because they had some 160 mostly Airbus airlines. They don't get spare parts. You can cannibalize, which means you can, but you do this only once, which means on the technological side, I don't see that much of a build-up. Neither, I mean, not even in the conventional field. Russia is burning its modern conventional capacities and doesn't have the capacity to reconstitute them.
Yeah.
This is why T-54 tanks are driving around, built in 1954. This is not last technology. So theoretically, yes, but Russia is driving the entire thing against the wall. And this also implies economic consequences, which will be visible at the end of the war, whenever this will happen.
Yeah. I'd like to sort of come back to Germany for a moment. You were talking earlier about the fact that we're back in a nuclear world. There are issues around deterrence, around information, but also around impacting policy and strategy, and that Germany, as a player on the world stage, has to influence the policies and strategies of others, of allies, whether it be in Washington, in Paris, in London. And you also talked about the fact that in Germany, the political elites have forgotten a lot when it comes to nuclear deterrence. One question is, how has your book been received? And do you think that this is helping sort of build the nuclear IQ in Germany? And the other is, what are your recommendations for how Germany can influence policy and strategy and sort of be part of that conversation, even though it is not a nuclear country?
Well, first, I was completely surprised. I wrote this little booklet. It's a booklet only, just basically because it was the time, and I thought it's something for the experts. And I'm surprised how broadly it has been received. It is still not on the Spiegel bestseller list, and it will not be in the New York Times ever. But it is something which 4 or 5 years ago would have been completely dead. So no one would have taken it. I could present it actually last week in the German Defense Committee. So there is an interest there because just the topic is timely. And what can NATO do? What can Germany do? I mean, it is very simple. You bring up an initiative in NATO. By the way, the fact that we have this NATO nuclear strategy of 2012 was because of a negative impact of Germany. We had at that time the German Foreign Minister Westerwelle, who wanted to get rid of US nuclear weapons from German soil. And he brought this proposal into NATO. It was, of course, a shock for NATO, and NATO tried to sneak away from this by agreeing on, let's talk on a new nuclear consensus. And then we became a new nuclear consensus, which was even more rigid than the previous one. So not what Minister Westerwelle intended, just to say that if a major player brings in an initiative, as Germany did with the NATO enlargement, as other countries do with other things they are interested in, you bring it in, you push forward, and then you will have this because it is the need. There is no document on what NATO as an alliance sees right or wrong with regard to nuclear deterrence. We don't have it. Or the one we have is overdue.
Yeah. One of our viewers just submitted a question about Germany's nuclear IQ and writes, in terms of raising Germany's nuclear IQ, are there any lessons that can be drawn from Germany's F-35 purchases? i.e., is it easier in Germany to speak about delivery vehicles and supporting conventional infrastructure, basing integrated air and missile defense, before moving on to discussions about the B-61s?
One point which I forgot, by the way, the Munich Security Conference, which is a huge institution, they have a huge project now going on, which is called Raising the Nuclear IQ. So it comes from various angles, this idea that we have to do something on this. On this thing, German discussing the F-35 and everything, I mean, let's face it, nuclear deterrence is not something that sells easy, particularly in this country, because we have the lessons of the Cold War. And if the Cold War would have become a hot one, we Germans would not have been concerned about the end, because we would have been all dead. Okay, so being the battlefield, and we are still fairly close geographically to the the potential aggressor is not something which you wholeheartedly support with joy, and it is something you take it as a necessary evil. On the good side, however, this is the reason why we had this fundamental change in Germany throughout the last 1.5 years, simply because there is a sensation in Germany, in the public, of closeness of the war. This is not Afghanistan. The distance from Kiel in the north of Germany to Garmisch-Partenkirchen in the south of Germany is the same than from Berlin to Lviv to Ukraine, which means it is physically close. So that's why we have all these discussions. We will never have a broad. I mean, this is also not a topic for the broad public. I mean, they're interested in taxes, in healthcare for good reasons in every country, but at least the security policy elites need to be rebriefed on all these things. And this is not rocket science because everything is there. Just take the old books, take the old lessons, and then you know what you have to do.
So you said earlier that you have high hopes for the Zeitenwende, and particularly for the nuclear Zeitenwende, if you will, because it came from a government led by the Social Democrats and the Greens, prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Particularly within the Social Democrats and the Greens, one saw large peace movements, if you will, and opposition to these kinds of deterrence ways of thinking. It's also interesting to think about sort of the generational shift. And so I'm very curious about how one goes about educating and informing the successor generation about these issues. It's important to hear that the Munich Security Conference is trying to raise the national nuclear IQ. But what would your guidance be in terms of how to really inform the public as a whole, inform younger people, and who are the people that you think need to be better informed about nuclear deterrence as a tool?
Well, first, I'm optimistic on the Zeitenwende in general, also because we have a completely different situation in the parliament, that we have broad support. We're discussing on the nuts and bolts, but there's a broad support in general. Whether this translates one-to-one to the nuclear field, let's see. I hope, but this is not taken for granted. It starts all with education. It starts with the universities, because the future civil servants in the ministries come from the universities today. I can recall that when the red-green government started in 1999, they provided a huge millions package for peace research in Germany, 170 million Deutschmark, I think, for peace research. I would wish only a fraction of this money, not for peace research, but for strategic discussion, for strategic analyses. We have only one chair in Germany, Mr. Neitzel, Professor Neitzel in Potsdam, who does strategic issues. So it has to start with the universities. It's interesting to see that you see it now on the students' level. I just learned, I thought I didn't trust my ears. There is a nuclear strategy students working group Germany-wide, which are trying to, maybe it's a grassroots movement, maybe it is. We have a number of students associations which are dealing now specifically with security policy, and they grow. They always had a niche existence for decades. Now they are growing because the topic is there, but it has to start with universities. The state has to provide chairs. It would be good if the German government would have a chair. I mean, the German government gave a Henry Kissinger chair a couple of years ago. Such a chair for nuclear or for strategy, for strategic questions would be helpful. It's not that costly. This is something that should be done. Whether this happens, I don't know. For the time being, you see a number of grassroots movements.
I mean, I would hope that some of those student groups reach out to you and ask you to spend an hour with them for a briefing. I think that would be incredibly valuable for them and informative. As we start to sort of wrap up our time together today, I'd like to maybe take a step back and ask you a broader question. I mean, you and I have known each other for a very long time, and we've talked about how difficult it sometimes is for, or has been for, Germany to talk about its national interests, right? Its nationale Interessen. And I definitely see this deterrence question sort of feeding into the overall question of whether it has become acceptable, whether it's become salonfähig for Germany to talk about its national interests. Of course, this summer we saw the release of a brand new national security strategy. We saw the release of a China strategy. Germany sort of is feeling its way forward in this. I think there's some agreement that both of those documents were very good Bestandsaufnahmen, or sort of assessments of what the current situation is. But some critics have said that they've fallen short of mapping out a plan moving forward. As a longtime security expert, and even if you want to look at it through the lens of nuclear deterrence, I'd be interested in sort of hearing your take on how acceptable it's become within Germany, but even for Germans on the international stage, to talk about and defend Germany's national interests.
First, I think it's interesting to see that in the national security strategy, there are national interests clearly defined. However, you always have to see this through the lens of Germany, from where we started. For instance, there is this remark that a German national interest is access to raw materials and the free movement on the seas. For an American, for a Brit, for a French, it is normal. What else? In 2011, our then president had to resign because he had exactly this request in a speech. So you see that we start from a completely different position than the big powers in defining their interests. So I think that the national security strategy is a start. It is, by the way, it's also very clear that every new government now coming, regardless in which combination, can do its own national security strategy, redefine interests, sharpen them, make them more explicit. All the alleged weaknesses which are there, which I don't see that much, because we had our marching order was do a very generic document and let all the specific ones go in the details, because otherwise it becomes a 500 pages piece. For that, I think it's already fairly good, because it, as I said, it's a true strategy and it is a hard security document. It's one of the few. I mean, we are not famous for doing hard security documents. Right. We are not famous for doing strategic documents. So once again, from the German point of view, according to our measuring rods, which are much smaller, lower than the French, British, or American, this is already a huge step forward. And then I'm happy to see the next government to take on all the leftovers, the National Security Council, yes or no, the National Security Advisor, the Kissinger in German, whatever, will be in the next step.
So let me ask one question, one final question for today, and it comes from one of our viewers. But let me tee it up this way. You know, earlier in our conversation, you were talking about how nuclear deterrence is back on the stage for Germany and for many other countries. This has meant a reliance on the United States during the Cold War, during the post-Cold War period. But you also talked about the fact that Germany needs to cultivate relations to its European neighbors like France and the United Kingdom, which are also nuclear powers, and basically make deterrence Trump-proof. And one of the mechanisms for that in Germany has been the 100 billion euro investment in the Bundeswehr through the Zeitenwende, stepping up Germany's defense spending. I think that this notion of Trump-proofing deterrence is an important one to keep in mind. But one of our viewers asks, as you think about the future, how would a President Trump or an American president like President Trump impact nuclear deterrence?
Well, it depends on what on what he does. I mean, if he would be as nuts as President Trump was, then he might blow up entire NATO. And then we are in a completely new world. And then we don't have to talk about this because then everything is completely different. I think that the key indeed lies in burden sharing. We have and this is not only money. It is, I mean, the sheer fact that the US, for very good reasons, now reorients itself to the Asia Pacific for very good reasons. Most of the European countries cannot act there militarily, but we can do much more for our neighborhood. So it's not only money, it's also disburdening the US from tasks in the European neighborhood, which can be easily taken by the Europeans. The US has 600 soldiers in Kosovo. Ask me why. Okay, these 600 don't save the US Army, but a president might not even know where this Kosovo is. And this it's a pure European issue. Many things happening in Israel now are closer to Europe than to the US. So more engagement there, which we are already showing. By the way, it was interesting to see how easy it was in Germany to say, we will deliver military material to Israel. No headline, no criticism. Imagine this 2 years ago. So there are a number of ways where burden sharing has to be defined under new circumstances, also having in mind what kind of Russia we have after the war. Is it a Russia so weak that the Europeans might be able to tackle this on their own, leaving the US for the Asia Pacific? Or is it more aggressive? Whatever, we will have to have a new transatlantic bargain based on the circumstances which we can see after the war. This includes also the nuclear business. Yeah.
Well, Karl-Heinz, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us today and unpacking the issues around Germany's nuclear deterrence. I've had a couple of questions from people asking when your booklet is going to be available in English, because there's a lot of interest in it.
I didn't know whether someone reads something on Germany in English, so that's why I didn't do it.
Well, not yet. I think as the interest continues, maybe you'll have to come back and do a translation. But I think certainly having conversations like this is incredibly important. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us and for pointing out some of the things that we need to be watching in the months and years ahead.
It was my pleasure.
Herzlichen Dank.
Ja.